Project management is one of the most complex yet important aspects of a digital transformation, but a lot of times organizations and teams don't know how to manage these sorts of projects well. So what I want to do today is provide a detailed deep dive training into how to manage an overall digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach the third stage of digital transformation success, typically by managing their projects. And we will help them through their digital transformations by helping them provide internal project management as well as managing other third parties. And what I want to do today is really dive into what some of the key lessons are, and some of the things you need to know as you're going through a digital transformation. Now, this video and this training is meant to dive into a lot of different aspects of digital transformation. We're going to start off by talking about the basics of what project management is and how it compares to program management, change management, and whatnot. But then we're going to dive into how to provide better project governance and controls and how to plan your project and how to put together the right strategy and plan. And then later in the video, we'll get into what makes a good project manager and some of the pitfalls that project managers often make. So this video is going to be intended for anyone who's obviously managing a project, but even if you're part of a overall core team or you're an executive sponsor, or if you're just involved in any sort of digital transformation, or if you're a consultant, this training is going to be for you. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent technology agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation, and you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey. Now let's jump back into today's content. First, I wanted to dive into what is project management. What are the basic fundamentals of project management? And this is a good place to start even if you're an experienced project manager, because I'm going to talk about it here in the context of not only what project management is, but more specifically, what project management is in the context of a digital transformation or an ERP implementation. One of the first components of project management that's most important to think about and to establish for your initiative is project governance and controls. These are the high-level overarching criteria and parameters used to manage your project. So these are the things that should align with your overall strategy, ensure that the project has clear decision criteria and parameters to help ensure that the project stays on track and stays aligned with your overall goals and objectives as an organization and with the overall goals and objectives of the overall initiative. Now, one problem we often see with project management is that you lose sight of what those overall goals and objectives of the project are. So in other words, it's not just to execute a certain number of tasks within a certain amount of time and a certain budget, although that may be one of your criteria. More importantly, it's a matter of executing the plan against a higher level set of goals and objectives that align with your overall strategy and objectives as an organization. So having the project governance and controls in place is important to ensure you have that alignment. And then when it comes time to go make decisions, such as should we expand scope, should we add new technology to the mix, should we change the course we're on with our overall project, you have a clear set of parameters and decision criteria you can use using those tools within governance and controls that I mentioned. Now, one of the key outputs and the key deliverables for project governance and controls is your project charter. And this is the way you document the different governance and controls that you have in place, the decision criteria, what the goals and objectives of the project are, what the resource requirements are, what the project plan is. All those things should be part of your project governance and controls to ensure that your project stays on track. Now, the next piece of project management is actually managing the plan and managing the tasks within the plan. And this is probably the most obvious part of project management, and most people think of this as the first thing they think of when they think about project management. So it's an important part of what you do as a project manager. It's not the only thing, it's not the most important part, but it is an important dimension of project management. So a lot of this has to do with setting milestones throughout the project, managing to those milestones, ensuring that you're on track, ensuring the tasks are getting completed when they should, following up with tasks when they're not completed on time, ensuring that you adjust the plan as things change over time. So if you miss key milestones or You miss a milestone on the critical path. I'll come back to that concept in a minute. But if you miss milestones that might affect your overall plan, you as a project manager need to ensure that you reestablish those milestones and recast the plan to reflect those changes. Now, one of the most important parts of managing tasks and managing to the plan is this concept of critical path. So I mentioned critical path a moment ago, and what critical path is it's any of the tasks within your plan that ultimately affect the overall duration of the project. So in other words, there's certain tasks within your plan that could be done in parallel. It doesn't really matter when they get done as long as they get done at some point along the way. But then other tasks have dependencies. There's other tasks downstream that are dependent on that task getting done first. So if that first task gets delayed, it delays a bunch of other tasks downstream, which delays the overall project. That's the critical path. And you might have multiple critical paths within your project. So it's important to understand that as part of your overall project plan and task management. But in general, these are the important things to think about within this dimension of project management. Now, in addition to task management, managing the plan, managing the project governance and controls, there's more of a qualitative art to project management, and that is project leadership. So in other words, rather than just managing tasks and checking dots or checking boxes to make sure that you've completed the tasks that should be completed, you also need to have a certain amount of leadership and qualitative strategic understanding of what needs to happen within the project. And this is where it comes time to make tough decisions at times, or knowing when to pivot. For example, oftentimes as a project manager, you're going to be tasked with assessing the resources you have on the project. And you may find that you have the wrong resources or you don't have enough resources. And so recognizing that and knowing and anticipating those problems before it affects your plan and before it delays your project plan is very important. And that's just a good example of project leadership. Another example is identifying risk. And I'm going to come back to risk management later in this video, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But in general, a good project leader will know how to anticipate risks, will know how to mitigate the risks, and will know how to pull in the key stakeholders that they need to make sure you rock some of those problems off center. Another example is when you don't have enough executive involvement or buy-in. It doesn't necessarily show up on your task list, doesn't necessarily show up in your project plan, doesn't necessarily suggest that you're delayed in your project plan or the execution of that project plan, but good project leaders recognize when you're not getting enough executive buy-in and support and when those risks are being anticipated to potentially affect the project later on. So that's another dimension, is project leadership, just to make sure you understand what's required to make the project successful beyond the quantitative and the more tangible things that you see in a project plan. Now, just a moment ago, I talked about risk mitigation and risk management, and that's a key component of being an effective project manager. You need to anticipate risks, know where the risks are coming from, identify what the root causes of the risks are, and ultimately define what the potential solutions and risk mitigation factors are. That's risk management. It's also referred to as quality assurance, to ensure that the project's on track, that you're looking beneath the details of what's in the project plan and really looking more strategically at how the project is functioning, where the headwinds are, where the risks are, where the potential problems might lie. So ensuring that you have a solid grasp and understanding and talent in identifying risks and ensuring quality assurance on your overall project is another key component of effective project management. Now, the last thing I'll leave you with as it relates to project management is the difference between program management and project management. So program management is generally viewed as a broader overarching initiative, whereas project management is more specific niches or specific projects within an overall program. So for example, if you're going through a digital transformation, let's say, you might have a project manager that manages the technical components of the digital transformation. You might have another project manager that handles organizational change management, another project manager that handles business process reengineering, et cetera, et cetera. But you need a program manager to tie all those pieces together, someone that can look at the big picture and tie together all those different work streams. And program management is especially important for larger initiatives and also larger organizations, or both. So it's important to make sure you understand the difference between project management and program management and not confuse the two, because if you do confuse the two, you might assume that by having multiple project managers, you've completed the job, you've filled the roles that you need to fill, but ultimately you need to have a program manager that oversees and manages all the different moving parts of an overall initiative. Now that we've talked about what project management is, it's important to shift gears and get into project governance. And I talked a little bit about project governance in the previous clip, but here I want to talk about project governance and controls. I want to talk about how to put the guardrails up for your organization and how to put the guardrails up so that you're managing the project effectively, you're staying on track, you're keeping everyone on the same page, and you're managing your outside third-party vendors the way you should. So in this segment, let's dive into what project governance is and how it should tie into your overall digital transformation. Project governance and controls are one of the biggest reasons for success, and they're also one of the biggest reasons for failure when you don't have those project governance and controls in place. Now, a lot of project managers think that if they just have a solid project plan and a solid resource plan and they keep an eye on tasks being completed in a timely basis, that's enough to keep the project on track. But there's a lot more to project governance and project controls than that. And what I want to do today are talk about the 6 things that are critical to ensure that you have the right project governance and controls in place for your transformation. Now, the first thing, and probably the most obvious thing that you need to have in place from a project governance perspective, is a very clear project plan. And not only do you need the project plan to be clear, but you need it to be realistic. So you need a realistic view of how much time, effort, resources, and budget the project is going to consume. And one thing you don't want to do in this case is to just take the proposed project plan that your software vendor or your system integrator provides to you, because there's 2 things that are wrong with those inputs. One reason is that those project plans are typically unrealistic to begin with. They have underestimated time and cost typically in those proposed project plans that they provide you during the sales cycle. And the second reason is because the project plans that are provided to you by software vendors and system integrators are typically not complete. They don't include everything that's required to make a project successful. So your project plan needs to do 2 things. It needs to take your system integrator or your software vendor's proposed project plan as an input, but you need to rationalize that plan, tailor it for your specific needs, and also add to that plan to create a more complete program management plan that includes all the other work streams outside the realm of what the system integrator does. Which brings me to the final point here, which is that you don't want to just assume that your system integrator's project plan is the project plan. There's inevitably going to be a lot of different activities that you're responsible for, that other third parties might be responsible for, and you want to make sure to have a complete plan that uses that SI or vendor plan as an input in one piece of it, but you need other pieces to complete the entire picture. And then finally, you want to make sure that your project plan is aligned with your overall strategy as an organization. So whatever direction you're going, whatever you're trying to accomplish as an organization, you need to make sure that you've translated those strategic goals and objectives into your project charter so that you have clear decision-making criteria and a clear vision for how this project is going to support the bigger picture strategy of your organization. So having that project charter, the project plan, the resource plan, the budget in a very realistic manner is one of the first keys to ensuring that you have the right project governance and controls in place. Now, the next component of an effective project governance structure is to make sure you're using the right methodologies and the right tool sets in deploying your transformation. Your software vendor will likely have some sort of technical software methodology for designing and building the software, but you also need to have methodologies that address things like change management and data migration, process improvement, things of that nature that are generally outside the realm or the scope of what the system integrators and the software vendors do well. So having that complete methodology that captures all of those different tools that are required to make the project successful is critical. The other thing you want to do is once you have these methodologies and tool sets that may have worked in past situations and past instances, you want to make sure that they're aligned with what you're trying to accomplish as an organization and that they're aligned with the culture of your organization. So for example, one common challenge we see in today's day and age are methodologies that are centered around agile development methodologies. And agile, for those that don't know, is a way to basically create little bite-sized chunks of an implementation and start deploying technology faster to the organization. And most software vendors are migrating toward an agile development approach, which is very hot right now in the software development space, but a lot of bigger organizations especially find that it's not suitable to use an agile development methodology when a more traditional waterfall methodology might work better. So that may or may not be relevant to your organization, but that's one example of how a canned methodology off the shelf may or may not fit your organization. And you want to make sure that you really rationalize and validate and tailor those methodologies and tool sets for your organization and what you're trying to accomplish. One of the most surprising things about transformations that catch a lot of project teams off guard is just the sheer number of decisions that need to be made operationally as it relates to the project plan, resources, that sort of thing. And oftentimes, executives will delegate those decisions to the project team and assume that they're just going to handle everything that needs to be handled in terms of decision making. But that's not necessarily the right answer. Executives ultimately, at times, will need to make decisions around what our operational model will look like, or how we're going to resource a project, or what sort of strategic decisions we need to make as an organization. And while the project team might be in a good position to make a recommendation or to suggest what might be the best fit for your organization, it's ultimately up to the executive team to ensure that they're at least blessing any sort of recommendations that are made. Or in some cases, if the project team can't arrive at any sort of consensus, it may be the executives that need to rock the decision off center to be able to get to that decision and get the alignment that's needed organizationally. One of the biggest mistakes that organizations make, and executive teams in particular make, is they push all the decision making to the project team and just force them to make decisions that they may not be in the best position to make. So for example, if you're implementing a solution that affects both sales and finance, for example, what's best for finance, or a decision that's best for finance, may not be the best decision for sales, and you find yourself at an impasse, or at the very least you find yourself caught up in a political indecision. So you want to make sure that your executives are prepared to make those sorts of decisions, and you want to make sure you've clearly defined what decisions get made by the project team versus what decisions get escalated to either the project sponsor or the executive team. So those are some things to think about as you think about decision making within your project governance structure. If there's one thing on our list here today that seems like it may have nothing to do with project governance, but really it does, that's going to be your business case. Oftentimes organizations think of a business case as something that's meant to rationalize a decision or to justify an investment in technology, which it certainly is. It can be used for that, and it oftentimes is. But what people don't understand, and one of the secrets and the secret values of business cases, is that they provide a very strong project governance framework. If you've done it right and you have a realistic business case that outlines your expected cost, and more importantly, your expected business benefits and your business value from the transformation, that's going to help you tremendously in the decision-making and the project governance process. And to give you an example, one common thing we see, probably the number one value of business case as a project governance tool, is that we often see organizations and project teams that are faced with requests to customize software. Someone somewhere in the organization wants to change the software to do something it wasn't built to do. Sometimes it's for a good reason. It's a strategic competitive advantage that they're trying to change. In other cases, it's a symptom of resistance to change. So instead of having qualitative anecdotal debates or philosophical debates about whether or not we should customize function A or B or C, we can actually point to the business case and look at what is the cost of customizing software in this example versus what is the business value we'll get out of it. If it helps us achieve meaningful material business value, then maybe it does make sense to invest in that sort of customization or whatever the decision might be. But if it doesn't, we can't quantify the business benefit, or there is no business value, but there's a relatively high cost to implement that change within the project, then the decision becomes pretty clear that that's a hard no. So the business case can be a very effective tool for project governance. If you don't already have one in place as part of your decision-making process or your planning process, I highly encourage you to create a cost-benefit analysis, if anything, just to help you with the project governance process. Another activity that may not sound like a project governance activity, but really it is change management, organizational change management, to be clear. The reason for this is that organizational change puts a lot of pressure on project governance, and it can create a lot of challenges with the project overall. It can derail a project. If you don't have effective change management, that's when you get misalignment, that's when you get resistance to change, and no amount of perfection in project governance and execution is going to be able to overcome massive resistance to change. So having change management in place is almost an insurance policy or a way to hedge and mitigate some of those risks that can disrupt project governance and project execution. And to get a better idea of how organizational change management can help you in your project and your project governance, I've included our guide to effective organizational change management. I've included a link to that below. Be sure to download that. It has a ton of best practices and lessons and prescriptive best practices that you can use to ensure that you have effective change management baked into your overall project governance. Finally, and arguably most importantly, you want to make sure that your project governance includes a very solid risk management framework. We at Third Stage use a 13-point risk management and risk assessment framework that we use throughout the entire project for new projects, but also clients that hire us to come figure out what went wrong with a failed implementation. We also use that same framework to help in expert witness cases where attorneys hire us to come in and provide an independent expert opinion on why a project failed. So a framework like that, something that's technology agnostic, that's independent, it can be very powerful, and it's very important to anticipate and spot and detect risks before they become apparent. And that's part art and it's part science, but having the right framework and the right expertise and skill set supporting you in your transformation will ensure that you're able to mitigate those risks before they become unavoidable. And one other word of caution is you want to make sure that it's not your system integrator providing that quality assurance or the risk mitigation in your implementation. That would be much like someone grading their own homework and doing a self-assessment of how great they are. You need to know not just how great they are, you need to know where the risks are. So that risk mitigation framework should be independent of the system integrator, and it should be someone that has nothing to gain or lose by identifying the appropriate risks and the risk mitigation strategies. Now that we understand the fundamentals of project management and the fundamentals of project governance, let's talk more about what specific roles and responsibilities are. What does a project manager do, and how does what a project manager does, how does that compare to other project team members that are involved in the overall transformation? And this is really important because a lot of times organizations think of project management as something that just requires a PMI or a PMP certification, Project Management Institute, for example. And that's important. Certifications certainly are important, but there's a lot of nuances of project management that go into a digital transformation, and that's what we're going to dive into in this next module. Effective project managers are hard to come by. They're unique skill set, a unique personality type that can be very difficult to find. And a lot of times project managers focus on the wrong things. They may mean well, they may have the right raw skills, but they're not focused on the right things. So part of what I want to talk about here today is what is project management, not only the way it is today, but the way it should be to be more successful, but also what should the role of an effective project manager be, and that's what I want to talk about. First key to being a good, successful project manager is to understand the difference between program management and project management. Now, project management generally is more tactical. It's more checking the list and making sure that things are getting done on time and on budget. That's an important skill set for sure, but program management, looking more strategically at the entire project and multiple work streams, is equally important, if not more important. And just to give you an example, if you're involved in a technology transformation of some sort, you may think of yourself as a project manager for a technology implementation. But to be successful, you need to think of yourself as a program manager for an overall business and digital transformation that happens to include a very heavy technology component. So in other words, there might be other work streams that you need to be managing that aren't typically in the realm of a technical or a technology work stream. So things like organizational change management, business process improvement, overall strategic alignment, integration, architecture. A lot of different components in moving parts go into an effective transformation. So when you're viewing your job and defining your job and your plan and where you dedicate your time and focus and your skill set, it's really important to think more broadly about program management rather than simply project management. The second thing that's very important to consider to be an effective project manager is to think of yourself as a business leader and to really focus on your business leadership capabilities. And what I mean by that is augmenting your technical and functional capabilities, more that heads down, hands-on skill set that you probably have or are developing. Augment that with more of the business leadership and the bigger strategic view of what your organization or what your customers or clients' organizations might be accomplishing if you're an outside consultant. So really understanding the overall business and where the business is headed and being able to think strategically about the business, not just the technology or what the immediate hands-on deployment is you might be trying to manage. And that connection of the dots between tactical project management execution with the overall strategy and business is a critical skill set that a lot of project managers miss, and a lot of them, quite frankly, aren't very good at it. So the better you can educate yourself and develop experience on the business side, the better project manager you're going to be as well. I've worked with a lot of good project managers over the years, and I've worked with a lot of poor project managers over the year, and most are somewhere in between. And one of the most common flaws of project managers is a tendency to focus on checking boxes. So in other words, I've got a task list of 20 things that need to be done by tomorrow, and either it gets done or it doesn't. It's more of a binary, yes, no, I finished or I didn't. And the problem with most work streams within a transformation of any sort, especially if it's a complex business or digital transformation, is that it isn't simply a yes, no answer of did you do it or not. It's did you do it in a way that's aligned with the overall business objectives? Did you do it in a way that achieves the quality expectations of the organization or the project? Did you do it in a way that impacts and enables a more effective organization? Those are just a few examples of the types of things you should be thinking about. So rather than just going through your Gantt chart or your project plan saying, yes, we did this, or no, we didn't do that, it's a matter of really assessing the shades of gray in between of how well did we do these things, and could we have done things better to be more aligned, and should we be doing things better and dedicating more resources to migrate in that direction of doing things more effectively. So really think less about checkboxes and yes, no, binary answers, and more about those gray areas of how well are we doing things and how can we improve. Some of the most effective project managers I've worked with in my career are the ones that not only have the tangible hard skills, so things like understanding Gantt charts and project plans and some of the real technical aspects of project management, but the ones that can do that, but also do change management and some of the soft skills that go along with change management. So people that understand organizations, organizational behavior, how to manage change, they've led complex changes in the past, they understand what it takes to improve a business operation. Those soft skills are arguably more important than the technical skills of project management. And I don't want to be dismissive of the technical skills because that is important. You do need that fundamental foundation. But I wouldn't focus just on those technical and functional project management skills. I'd really broaden your skill set to also understand organizational change management, because ultimately organizational change management will be the thing that makes or breaks your project. Now, one of the more important technical and tangible hard skills is enabling effective project governance and controls in your project. So not just having a solid project plan, but having the overall governance. So how decisions get made, how you ensure alignment, how you prioritize resources, how you escalate risks, how you identify the risks in the first place. All those things are largely art. It's more art than science, although you can certainly translate a lot of those pieces of art into a tangible plan and tangible actions, and you should translate those into tangible actions and plans. But identifying those things and knowing what kind of governance structure makes the most sense for your organization and your particular transformation is very important. And this is where one size does not fit all, and you want to create a governance structure that may have worked for you in the past, but you're also tailoring it for the specific needs of this particular transformation. So in other words, if you're part of a flat organization that's used to a lot of collaboration and sort of a messy decision-making process, that's okay, but that sort of culture and environment is going to need more than most organizations, going to need a little bit more structure and a little bit more clarity around how decisions get made and how decisions get escalated up. And it's also going to force and bend the organization to be a little bit more structured and accountable than they might be used to in this sort of situation or this example. So really aligning that overall project governance and your risk mitigation strategy and your overall controls with the culture of the organization and what you're trying to accomplish from a business perspective is extremely important. The bottom line is effective project managers are largely jacks of all trades. I have yet to meet a really good project manager that is simply a project manager. They jockey behind a desk and they keep track of Gantt charts and budgets and resource plans, and they manage all that stuff while other people make all the business decisions or the organizational decisions or the technology decisions, integration decisions. You need that hard skill set, but more importantly, you need that broader skill set to be a jack of all trades, to be able to navigate and move and be agile with the evolving nature of any sort of transformation or any sort of organization for that matter. So if you're a project manager and you're looking to really take your skill set to the next level, I'd highly encourage you to maybe pick off one or two areas outside of your comfort zone that brings you more into that business and overall strategic domain rather than just the project management domain. One of the big mistakes that project managers often make and that organizations make when they're managing their own internal projects is they think of the technical work stream as the overall project. And what I want to do in this next segment is dive into the difference between project management, which is focused on one piece of an overall program, and compare that project to an overall program. So what's a program, what's a project, and if the project is not a complete program, what are the other aspects of the program? And this is really important because we don't want to myopically focus just on one technical work stream. We want to focus on the non-technical work streams as well, because those non-technical work streams are more likely to impact success or failure. So we as project managers have to think outside the box of managing a technology initiative and think more as a program of an overall business and digital transformation. As organizations are going through digital transformations, one of the first things they focus on typically is project management. How do we get the right project manager? How do we ensure that we have the right project plan? How do we ensure that we have the right resources allocated to that project? But what ends up happening is organizations miss out on the bigger picture of an overall program, especially if you're going through a transformation in the context of not just technology implementation, but more importantly, more of a business transformation. Program management becomes even more important in those cases. So what I want to do today is talk about the difference between project management and program management and unpack those differences so that you can ultimately define a digital strategy that encompasses both and ensures that you've captured the things that are required to be successful in your digital transformation. Now, the topics I'm going to talk about today are also topics that you can find in our digital transformation report, an annual report we publish each year that highlights some of the benchmarks and lessons and trends from digital transformations in the last year. And it also includes a number of software reviews and independent rankings of different technology options in the marketplace. So I encourage you to download that digital transformation report, which covers these topics that I'm going to talk about today, but it also covers a lot of other topics that will help you through your digital transformation. So to start, I want to talk about project management. And that's the thing that I think most of us can get grounded in and really understand when it comes to digital transformation. So I'm not just going to call this project management, though. To clarify and be more specific, I'm going to call this software project management. And I'll discuss here in a moment why that is such an important differentiator. So software project management is essentially what most of us think about and most of us focus on when we hire a system integrator, for example, or a software vendor that's going to manage the software implementation. So this is where we get into things like the technical configuration. This is where we get into the overall design. Even before you get to the config, you have the design of the software. You'll have the technical testing of the software. And then ultimately, you're going to have the go live of the software. This is obviously not an all-inclusive project plan, but I want to call out these tasks that are commonly included within a software vendor or system integrator's proposal as the project management. Now, I don't want to be dismissive of the concept of software project management, but the reason I call this out and separate it is because it's one piece of an overall program. I'll talk in a few minutes about what those other components are, but it's really important to understand that when you hire a system integrator and a software vendor, they're really the project lead for a technical work stream. So project management is important here, but the project management is typically focused on deploying technology. And as we'll talk about, there's a lot of other pieces of a transformation that are just as, if not more important than this. And if all we do is focus on this, then what we're doing is we're underestimating the amount of effort, the amount of resources, the amount of tasks and deliverables that need to happen within a transformation. And we're neglecting all the things over here that I haven't gotten to yet that are even more important to ensure that we're successful. So to start, we want to understand what the technical project management is, but next we're going to talk about what some of the other components and work streams are within program management. So as we slowly start to unpack what program management is, I'm going to start by just saying we're going to have an overarching PMO. Typically, you want to have an overall enterprise program that's going to manage the entire program. So now what I want to do is talk about how this all ties together. Now, certainly within your overall PMO, and even if you don't have an internal PMO, by the way, this is something that you want to make sure you establish, is make sure you establish a program management office that can manage the overall program, including your software vendor and system integrator resources here. So the software vendor, software project management reports up to the PMO typically. And then that begs the question of, well, what else is there? Why do we have a whole PMO just to manage this? Well, the reason is because there's a lot more than just this. First of all, I'll say that software project management may be multiple work streams. So you may end up finding that you're not just deploying one technology, you're deploying a best of breed model, or you're deploying a core back office ERP system, but then you've got some third-party bolt-ons on top of that. So if you are deploying multiple technologies, you want to make sure that you recognize and identify that there's different threads, different software threads that have their own plans that ultimately need to be integrated up to the overall program. So that's the first thing, is you may have multiple technical and software work streams depending on what it is you're deploying. Now, secondly, even if you're just deploying one system, but especially if you're deploying multiple systems, you're going to have a segment for, call it the technical aspects that are not software specific. And specifically what I mean by this is overall system architecture, data, and integration. So it's really that overarching thread that ties together multiple technologies, and even within one technology, it ties together the different modules within this technology and any third-party bolt-ons you might have on top of that. That's really the architecture piece. So architecture, we're talking about solution architecture. How do these systems tie together? Not only the new systems that you're deploying, but in the interim, while you're deploying new technologies, chances are fairly high that you're going to want or need some sort of interim integration points to your third-party systems or your legacy systems that you have now. A lot of those systems, if not all of those systems, may go away eventually, but as you're going through the transformation, most organizations need to have that interim integration built. And so you need to have an overall solution architecture that defines how this is all going to tie together. The different technologies, the different modules within the same technologies, how does it all tie together? You also have your data and analytics, we'll call it. So this is where we get into data migration, data mapping, data cleansing, which is really just taking your old legacy data, making sure you clean it up, map it to the new system or systems, and then ultimately define what kind of analytics you want to get out of those new system or systems. So again, it does touch this part over here with project management, but typically this is out of scope with a software project manager and a software focused work stream. And then the other piece within this is the overall integration. And this is becoming an increasingly important function and an underrated function within digital transformation on the technical side, because even with the same software vendors, a lot of these software vendors have third-party systems that they've acquired that still have to be integrated with the core ERP or the core enterprise technology. So integration is very important, especially if you're deploying a best-of-breed model or you're using business intelligence and data analytics tools on top of a core enterprise technology. So this is another work stream, and this is a summary of some of the activities within the work stream that's not software specific, but it's very technical in nature. It needs to integrate with the overall PMO and overall program plan to augment what's being done here on the software project management side of things. So the next project within an overall program that needs to be managed within a successful digital transformation is organizational change management. And this is anything to do with the people side of change. And this also goes well beyond training and communications. Now, typically when you hire a software vendor and system integrator, they'll tell you that we are going to help you manage the change. We're going to do change management. We're going to do that in the form of technical training. In fact, that's a concept I didn't mention before. But here's where you would say, or where a vendor would say, we're going to do technical training to teach people how to use our system to perform transactions. That's an important part of change management, but it's one microcosm, one subset of an overarching change management plan. An overarching change management plan should look at things like change readiness. What kind of organization is it that you are today? What kind of culture do you have today? What are you trying to become? And what does that mean in terms of the potential organizational pitfalls that might come along with that and the potential sources of resistance that might come along with that? Another important work stream within change management is change impact. So this is where you look at where we are today in our current state, where we're going in our future state, and how different work groups and departments and individuals within an organization are affected by that. Because ultimately, we can't do this tech training on its own without having done this change impact. We need this change impact to be successful in our training so that we can get the changes out on the table and help educate people on what the changes will be well before we get to the tech training. So that by the time we get to technology training, now we're starting to reinforce what we've already communicated and worked through with our employee base. Now it's more a matter of just showing us how to do it within the new system. Too often, software vendors and system integrators jump straight to this, and it creates a ton of resistance and a ton of backlash within the organization because the organization isn't ready for all the massive changes that come with new technologies today. That statement, by the way, is more true the older your technology is and the more of a leap you're making in terms of upgrading your technologies. And then a final work stream I'll focus on today, although this is not every single work stream within change management that I'm talking about, but some of the highlights. Another one is the organizational design. So as we're defining the change impacts, We're typically doing that in conjunction with business process improvements. And as we're defining what the improvements are, we're identifying how people's jobs are impacted, and we're also defining how the new organization is going to look. What are the roles and responsibilities? I'm actually going to call that out as a separate or a call out here. Roles and responsibilities in this new organizational future state. And again, we need to understand this as an organization. Our people need to understand this so that A, they aren't alarmed by some of the changes that are coming as part of the transformation, but B, so we can get more business value out of the transformation and this massive investment we're about to make in new technology. So organizational design, roles and responsibilities is another important thread within change management. Now, for more information on what a complete change management program looks like, I've included a link to a video right here that you can click on that dives into more specifically what change management is. I have a number of other videos beyond that one video that talks about what some of the methodologies are, some of the tool sets, the deliverables you should focus on. I'm not going to dive into all that here today, but check out those videos on my YouTube channel for more information about what makes an effective change management program. And for even more information, I encourage you to download our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a report that I wrote, or a white paper that I wrote, that unpacks change management as a whole and talks about all the different work streams and threads within change management, and it gives you a roadmap for how to deploy a change management program. So I encourage you to download that Guide to Organizational Change Management in the links in the description field below. So we've talked about software project management, talked about architecture, data and integration, change management. Now, last but not least, is business process reengineering. So this is the whole business process thread of how we're going to change our business processes and what those processes are going to look like in the future. And a lot of times people think, well, we don't need to do this because we're already doing it over here when we deploy new software. There's some truth that this is going to drive to some degree what your business processes will look like. But if you don't have sort of a top-down vision of what you want your processes to be, regardless of what technology you're deploying, then this is going to become a very aimless work stream that's going to get out of control, go over budget, take a lot more time than it should because you don't have clarity on what you want your business processes to be. Today's modern ERP systems are more flexible than ever, and even the simplest workflows that you would think would be standard, vanilla, off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box type of technologies are not so. There's a lot of different decisions that need to be made, and if you don't have clarity on what you want your processes to be, which is why this is so important, this work stream quickly gets out of control. This work stream is impacted. You have a lot of problems here from a human adoption perspective. This becomes difficult as well because now you don't have clarity on how you're going to integrate and leverage different technologies to improve your business processes. So this is a core fundamental aspect of an effective digital transformation. And here's where you define your current state processes. You don't want to spend a ton of time here, but you do need to understand where you are today, partly because part of what you do today in most organizations, there's value in there. A lot of times executives and organizations as a whole think, let's not worry about this because this is our future state over here. Let's focus on the future state. Fair enough. You want to focus on the future state, but you do need to understand where you're starting from because there's a lot of value and a lot of core competencies you've built over decades, if not longer, that you want to preserve. And then, of course, there's improvements you want to make. There's pain points. There's deficiencies in your current business processes that you want to focus on improving. You want to prioritize what those things are, where the real business value is, what the business case justification will be. All that is an important part of defining the current state, which then leads us to the future state. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is us defining what our future state processes are so that now we can bridge the gap between current state and future state to do our change impact. Now we've got clarity on how we're going to deploy technology here and here, and it starts to pull together the entire transformation in that way. And then, of course, I mentioned a moment ago, you've got your business case. And this is where you quantify what the ROI is, what kind of business value you expect to get out of the transformation, where you're going to get the business value, and ultimately you use this as a tool to manage to business benefits realization as you go through the transformation and even after the transformation. Now, the reason this is so important is not only because you need to have clarity for business processes to help drive and enable some of these other work streams, but because it also gives you a lot of clarity and it gives you project governance and controls as it relates to PMO, or the Program Management Office. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So now we've talked about the different pieces of an overall program. We've talked about how software project management is different than some of these other work streams and why these other work streams are so important. But now you've got a lot of different work streams that need to be tied together. That's where program management comes into play. And again, this box is intentionally different than this box. You might have an SI or a system integrator, software vendor resource that is your technical project manager. They would fill this role here, but you still need someone up here that's providing the overall program management that now ties together all these different pieces. And so there's a few different components of program management here. One is making sure that we've got the project plans aligned across these different work streams. You've got a software vendor here that's going to come together with their proposal or their timeline of what they think the technical implementation looks like. You might have multiple software vendors doing the same thing if you have multiple systems you're deploying. You've got this piece, which is the architecture, data migration, integration, which is going to augment what's done here, and that's going to determine what the overall full plan looks like, as well as the full duration and timeline. Change management, of course, is its own animal. It's its own strategy that needs to be integrated with the overall transformation. And then, of course, business process improvement. And by the way, the things that are most likely to slow down a project and create disruption and cause a project to take longer than expected are these three right here. I don't want to say that this is rare, that you have delays or budget overruns here, but when it does happen, it's typically because there's issues over here that are affecting this piece here. So that's even more reason why you need a solid program management office to manage the entire program. Program management office is also important in terms of ensuring that we have project governance and controls in place. So I mentioned before how the business case is an important project governance tool because it gives us clarity and direction when we have a need to pivot or make decisions on what the project scope is going to be or where we might cut scope or add to scope. Someone has a customization request, someone wants to buy another module for technology. If we don't have this business case and ROI in place as sort of our guiding North Star for the transformation, we're going to be making these decisions based on gut feel and emotion. But here, with this in place, now we can make tangible business decisions on the rest of the project. Any changes that come along with the rest of the project, we can use this business case as a project governance tool to manage that entire thing. So essentially what the program management office is a way to tie together the entire operations or the entire set of work streams and the different projects within the overall program. And it's also a way to incorporate project governance with a project charter, the overall program plan, the business case, the overall vision and strategy for the project, the resourcing plan. All that stuff is really important from a program management perspective. And perhaps more importantly, and most importantly, is that by having this program management in place, this enables you, the implementing organization, not the system integrator, not the software vendor, but you, the implementing organization, you now have control and ownership of the overall program. And you should. This is your organization, you're deploying technology to improve your business, and you need that ownership and buy-in and support and control of the overall program. So what does this all mean to your digital transformation? Well, first of all, it means you want to open up your mind and look beyond software project management. And like I said at the beginning of this video, more often than not, software vendors and system integrators and value-added resellers propose a plan that focuses right here. But your transformation typically will entail all this other stuff, including the program management. So you want to make sure you have a full program plan that integrates all these pieces. You also want to make sure you've got project governance in place and program governance in place, and that you ultimately staff this in a way that allows you to have ownership of the overall program. And perhaps most importantly, the reason program management is so important and why this is so important to you as an organization is it allows you to focus on the things over here that are more important to success than the technical implementation. This is important, don't get me wrong, but this stuff is ultimately more important, especially these two right here. If we do this stuff really well and this really well, then chances are pretty high that this, the software project management and the architecture, data, and integration work streams are going to come together better than if you hadn't focused on those things. So I hope this has provided you some direction and guidance on the difference between project management and program management and how this might relate to your digital transformation. Change management is one of the most critical success factors for any digital transformation, but how does that compare and integrate with what a project manager does? And this is really important because even if you're not a change manager, even if you don't consider yourself a change practitioner, and if you're going to manage a project or be part of a core project, you need to understand how change management fits into it, or at least how it should fit into the overall project. So in this next module, we'll dive into how project management and change management are different and how you could bring the two together into a complete transformation program. Now, to gain a deeper understanding into what exactly project management is and what organizational change management is and how some of the best practices can relate to those two disciplines, I encourage you to read our book called Lessons from 1,000 Digital Transformations. In this book, we provide 20 different best practices to help make your digital transformation successful, both from a project management and from a change management perspective. So I encourage you to read that. You can access that via the QR code in front of you or the links in the description field below. First, it helps understand what project management is. And project management is essentially the planning and execution and the overall management of an entire digital transformation or any sort of change initiative. So this includes the planning, the scoping, the budgeting, the resourcing, the milestone tracking, the quality assurance, everything that's related to ensuring that a project plan is achieved across the board and that the resources are deployed effectively, the quality is being assured, and the budget and resources are being managed the way they should be. So essentially, project management is the overarching function of managing all of the different moving parts and pieces of a transformation, including but not limited to organizational change management. It also includes the technical work streams and workflows, the process reengineering, the data migration, and other key components of any sort of digital transformation. To gain a deeper understanding and a broader understanding of what project management is, I encourage you to check out this deeper dive summary video of what change management is right here in this video. You can find that on my YouTube channel, and I go into more detail of what project management is. But for today's purposes, I wanted to provide a summary of what exactly project management is. Now, we've talked about what project management is, but what exactly is change management and how is that different from project management? Well, organizational change management is essentially focused on ensuring that the human components of change are achieved in any sort of transformation. So in other words, organizational change management is one work stream within an overarching and a broader digital transformation. So while a project manager is going to manage all of the functions within a digital transformation, organizational change management is focused on one specific function, which is the people side of change. Now, there's a lot of different dimensions of change management, everything from ensuring that the internal organization is aligned, ensuring that executives are on board with the transformation, ensuring that we understand change impacts, ensuring that we're communicating the way we should, ensuring that we're effectively training employees on new processes and new ways of doing business. All of those different components are pieces of organizational change management. And while organizational change management is critical to effective change management and vice versa, they are two very distinctly different work streams and disciplines. Now, I won't dive into a ton of detail here today on what exactly change management is, but to learn more and to better understand the different deliverables and work streams within change management, I encourage you to check out this video right here on my YouTube channel called What is Organizational Change Management? That video dives into a lot more detail and provides some additional depth as to what change management is. But to summarize for today, change management is an important part, an important piece of an overall project, and effective project managers need to have effective change management, and effective change managers need to have effective project management to augment what they're doing. Now, while we've talked about how project management is different from change management, it's important to also call out and recognize how they're similar and where the intersections or the overlaps are between the two disciplines. First and foremost, it's important to recognize that there's an art and a science to both project management and change management. Project management is typically viewed as more of a science, and there's a specific process and certification that a lot of project managers will follow in terms of PMP certification and processes and whatnot, while change management oftentimes is viewed as more of an art. It's a little bit less tangible, sometimes it's more touchy-feely, and it's harder for a lot of people to understand because of that art side of transformation. But the reality is project managers need to also understand the art of change management. Change managers should understand the science of project management. So that's the first thing, is that there's very complementary strengths of these two disciplines that do overlap, and being able to do both or manage both well is extremely effective. The other commonality between the two is that in order to be an effective change manager and an effective project manager, you have to be good at managing different stakeholders. You have to understand the internal politics and internal dynamics of an organization going through a change in order to be effective at managing a project and managing change. And then finally, the other big commonality between these two disciplines is the fact that you have to have strong project management and strong change management in order for a project to be successful. If you're going through a digital transformation and you're extremely weak in either or both of those areas, project management, change management, the project is highly likely to fail. So if you're a project manager, you want to make sure you have a really strong change lead and a change management team. If you're a change manager, you want to make sure that you have a strong project manager. And in fact, you want to apply some of those project management principles to the way you manage organizational change. So the reality here is that they're very different disciplines. They are distinctly different fields and skill sets and strengths that are required to make those two work streams successful, but there's also a lot of overlap and they're critical to each other's success. Now, just to tie this all together, If we look at why digital transformations fail and why only a small subset of transformations are successful, it's largely because organizations fail in one or both of these areas. They either don't have effective project management overseeing and guiding and managing the project, and or they don't have effective change management to deal with the people side of change. So the bottom line and the summary here is that you have to have both in order to be successful. And as you're planning for your digital transformation, you want to make sure that you have strong project management, project governance to guide the overall project, and you have strong organizational change to ensure that you've addressed the people side of change. While these two disciplines alone can't guarantee success, they do exponentially increase your likelihood of success if you do these two things well. Now that we understand the fundamentals of what all these different aspects of project management are, what the roles and responsibilities are, how project management is different from change management, program management, all the stuff we've talked about so far, now it's important to get a little more tactical. The how do we do stuff now? And one of the first things you have to recognize is how to complete the implementation planning process. And we at Third Stage oftentimes refer to implementation planning as phase 0. It's before the technical implementation begins in earnest, but it's building that foundation and architecture for the overall program to make sure that by the time the technical work stream starts, you've got complete ownership of and a clear strategy and plan for the overall implementation in a way that makes sense to your organization. So what I want to do in this next video is really unpack what is implementation planning phase 0, what are the different components of it, and what should you be considering as you developed your overall project strategy and plan. One of the big things we do is we help them evaluate and select new software. And once we've helped them evaluate and select new software, we help them implement it. And one of the really fascinating things we noticed when organizations choose the technology is that the motivation and the morale and the excitement for the project is at an all-time high. People are really excited to just jump in and start working on this project that is surely going to improve their businesses and make their jobs easier. This is an understandable response to new technologies, but there's a step in between that organizations often forget, and that is phase 0 of the implementation. In other words, there's a phase that needs to be inserted between software selection and implementation to make sure that the organization's ready. And if an organization's not ready and they don't have their ducks in a row and they don't have a blueprint for what they want to be when they grow up, chances are very high that the project is ultimately going to fail, or at the very least, the organization is going to spend way too much time, way too much money, and way too much chaos and heartache on the project. So what I want to do today is unpack this phenomenon and talk about what phase 0 is, why it's so important, and what the different components of phase 0 are so that you can be better prepared and make better use of your technology investments. If you're an organization going through a digital transformation or an ERP implementation, and your executive team isn't all on the same page, or they don't have a clear vision of how this project is going to support their future direction, then I would suggest you're not ready to start the project. You shouldn't be starting the project. And the reason for that is it creates a lot of headwinds that work against you as a project team. Let's just assume you have an executive team of, say, 7 people. If you start on a project and those 7 people on the executive team have 7 different opinions of what they want this project to be and what they want the organization to look like in the future, that project is destined to fail. So what we have to do is make sure that we get the executives on the same page and that we get the project and the overall direction of the project on the same page with the executives. If we don't do that, then the project will run into problems later on, and that's going to end up costing you a lot more time and money than it would have taken you just to get this right up front. So one of the first things you could do in phase 0 is make sure that you have strategic alignment, that you've taken the time to really focus on and articulate what the future direction of the company is and how exactly this project will support that future direction. And I'll just give you a couple examples here. Some of the examples of decisions that need to be made and agreed upon by the executive team would be things like, what are our overall goals and objectives for this project? In other words, what are those quantifiable, measurable results we expect from the project? How much do we want to standardize our business processes? Which parts of our business do we want to standardize? Which parts do we want to leave independent or decentralized? How much are we willing to change our business to fit the software versus changing the software to fit the business? These may sound like technical decisions or project management-based decisions, but these are decisions that have to be made by the executive team, or at least agreed upon by the executive team. And these aren't easy answers, by the way. There's a lot of trade-offs, a lot of pros and cons and risks to whatever decision you make, and so it takes time to work through that. But once you get alignment and you get everyone on the same page, now all of a sudden you've converted headwinds into tailwinds, and you can start your implementation. It's going to be a lot more successful. So make sure you have strategic alignment. That's one of the first steps in phase 0. One of the most common fallacies with digital transformation is that if you just pick the software and deploy the software, that will determine what your business processes are going to look like in the future. This is a very flawed assumption because today's modern technology is so flexible that there's a lot of different ways, a whole multitude of different ways that you can deploy that technology. And if you don't have a sense of what you want the technology to do, it's going to take you a lot of time making those decisions as a team while the meter's running and you're racking up time and cost and expense on the project. So it's really important that you have that sort of blueprint from a future state operating model and a future state business process perspective of what you want to look like. And I'm not suggesting here at this point that you go down to the micro level of detail of defining individual transactions and workflows and different screens you might use, because you may not know. This is new technology and there's only so much you know about the technology before you deploy it. So instead, what we need to do is start at that macro level, define what our end-to-end business processes are, what are the common business processes we might want to deploy throughout the organization. If we're an organization that's gone out and acquired through mergers and acquisitions, and we have 10 or 20 different ways of operating, we might need to take some time to decide what's that one way we're going to operate when we deploy technologies. Now, if you think about it, if we don't make those decisions up front, those decisions will take up a lot of time during implementation, and worse yet, it'll create a lot of resistance to change because now you're going to have people infighting and bickering over what that future state should be. So you want to get all that out on the table and work through that messiness early on. And again, by doing this and creating that operational blueprint, you're going to create exponentially more value and more efficiency and more cost reduction later on during your implementation than if you hadn't done that. So defining your future state business processes and operating model is a key part of Phase Zero. And to learn more about how to do this, how do you handle business process management within Phase Zero, I encourage you to check out this video on my YouTube channel that dives into business process management and how it works. You may have heard that organizational change management is one of, if not the, most important reasons why digital transformations fail. But organizations commonly don't understand what change management is, or they assume that their organization is immune to resistance to change and other change issues. Because again, when you first start a project after you've selected technologies, there's this misleading perception that everyone's excited about the project, therefore change management won't be difficult. The reality is it is going to be difficult. It's going to be a lot more difficult than you expect. In fact, I have yet to meet a CIO or any project team member anywhere in the world for any client I've ever done work with that has said change management was easier than they thought, or that they've done enough change management through the project. Every single case or every single instance, even with clients we've worked with, have said they wish they would have spent more time on change management. So the question is, well, what do we do at this point in the project? We don't know what the changes are yet. We don't know what the business processes are going to look like necessarily, at least not at the detail level. And we certainly aren't ready to start training or detailed communications or anything of that nature. What we can do is start to anticipate where the pockets of resistance are going to reside within the organization. And we also can start to assess how severe that resistance to change might be. And the way we do that is through an organizational readiness assessment, which involves two prongs. One is a quantitative anonymous employee survey. The other is a qualitative set of focus groups that together paint a picture of what the culture of the organization is, what some of the strengths and weaknesses of the organization are. And if you're skilled at doing this and you do this day in and day out like our team does at Third Stage, you'll know what some of those anticipated points of resistance are going to be. And you can create a change management strategy that really surgically targets those areas to proactively address those areas of resistance before they become unmanageable. Now, on the surface, if you ask employees if they're ready for change or if they're excited, chances are pretty high. Most, if not all of them, are going to say, yep, we're excited, we're ready, we understand. We don't like our current systems and our current processes, so we're craving new technologies. However, when you start to peel back the layers of the onion and you start to define how jobs are going to change and which jobs are going to have things taken away, which jobs might be automated or centralized, which spreadsheets might be taken away, all those things create resistance. And so we have to anticipate what those things are so that we can start to create a change plan around that. And that's why we want to do this organizational readiness assessment as part of Phase Zero. And the final thing I'll say here is that organizational change management is typically on the critical path. In other words, it's resistance to change that elongates a project plan. So if we don't know what our change strategy is and how long it's going to take for our people to change, we don't have a realistic implementation plan. So in order for us to define a realistic implementation plan, which I'm going to come back to that point here in a minute, we need to understand what the change strategy is. Now, to learn more about change management and what it is and how it works, I encourage you to dive into this video right here. It's a detailed training video that I published on my YouTube channel that dives into organizational change management and some of the different components that you should be aware of. Or if you prefer to read more about change management, you can download our guide to organizational change management by scanning this QR code right here or via the links below. Now, once we have strategic alignment, we've defined our future state business processes, we've done the organizational assessment so that we can create a change strategy. Now we need to look at what the program management strategy is. How are we, the organization, not our outside consultants, but how are we, the organization, going to manage this project in the overall program? And when I say program, I mean not just the technical project, I mean the entire program. So yes, you're going to hire software vendors and implementation technical partners that will do the technical pieces of things. But you also need to have a change management team, a process improvement team, an architecture and data and integration team. You might have multiple technologies that you're deploying, so that might mean you have multiple technology projects that you're managing. That should all feed up into an overall program that you manage and you have a strategy for. In addition to having an overall program strategy and plan, you also want to make sure you have the right governance and controls in place, the right risk mitigation measures, the things that allow you to manage the project from a business and technology and people perspective, and also allows you to manage your third-party vendors as well. Now note that I'm not suggesting that your implementation technology partner do that for you. They can't do that for you. They can manage the technical work stream, but only you are well equipped to manage that entire program, and you should have that ownership within your organization. Now, my team here at Third Stage, we commonly will help clients build out their program management capabilities and advise them along the way and really act as an extension of their program management team. But in general, you want to ultimately own that yourselves. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the difference between program management, project management, and how to structure an entire program, I encourage you to check out this video on my YouTube channel right here where I whiteboard out what a program is and how that's different from project management. Now, you may be wondering, why have we not talked about implementation planning? What's the actual implementation plan and why are we waiting this long to do it? First of all, I'll say that none of this is really sequential that I'm talking about. A lot of this will happen in parallel, but everything I've talked about so far in this video now should ultimately feed into and influence the overall implementation plan. And now that we know what the processes are going to look like and the magnitude of change with those processes and how well aligned we are as an organization, what our change strategy is, now that we know all that stuff, now we can create an implementation plan. Now you may also be wondering, well, my software vendor already gave me an implementation plan. Why would I do that now? Yes, they did give you an implementation plan as part of their proposal, most likely, but it's also highly, highly likely that it's unrealistic, doesn't have realistic assumptions, and doesn't fit your unique needs. And the other part of that is they probably just gave you a project plan for the technical work stream, not the overall program that includes the business process and the people aspects of the transformation. So for that reason, you need to take all these things we've talked about from phase 0 and use that as a way to create the overall implementation plan, which can use the software vendor's implementation plan as an input, but you've got to add a lot of stuff to that, a lot of other activities that weren't included in their plan, and a lot of new assumptions that might be more realistic for your organization. Now, my final component of phase 0 planning is the business case and the benefits realization plan. This is where you really refine and fine-tune the business value and the quantifiable business benefits you expect to get out of the project. It's where you refine the overall cost of the project because you probably didn't know what the real costs were until you went through this phase 0 exercise. And it's where you also define what the business benefits are and the benefits realization plan. So we've talked about not just business benefits to justify the investment in the project, but we want to convert that business case into a benefits realization plan that has a detailed plan of how we're going to achieve those benefits, which modules or process improvements or job changes are going to enable that business value. And that's going to allow us to do two things. One is it's going to allow us to ensure that after we deploy new technology, we go back to that benefits realization plan and look at how we're doing and how we're tracking so that we can make improvements and optimize our implementation to maximize the value we get from our investment. But even shorter term and more fundamental is that during the implementation, that business case and benefits realization plan is going to help us make a lot of decisions that we might not otherwise be able to make. In other words, if we have questions around scope or whether or not we should customize or whether or not we should increase the budget of the project, we're going to be making that decision in a vacuum if we don't have a business case and benefits realization plan to go back to say, here's the business value that we do or don't get if we do or don't invest additional funds or additional time, additional modules, et cetera. So the business case and benefits realization plan is a great way to provide sort of the guardrails for the overall project to ensure that we have that North Star to make the right decisions that are going to add the most value to our organization. Now, when we talk about the implementation planning phase 0 that we just discussed, the next step is to define an overall plan and estimate what the overall plan is. That's one of the deliverables from phase 0 implementation planning, is to actually have the plan that we're going to execute to going forward. And this is really important because if we don't get the plan right, we don't have the right assumptions, we don't have realistic expectations, chances are very high that this project is going to derail, go over budget, and create somewhat of a train wreck for the organization. So we've got to make sure we have a realistic plan, but how do we do it? And that's what I want to do in this next segment, is talk about how to create a realistic plan, not just one that your software vendor proposes to you, but one that is complete with all the non-technical components as well, and one that is realistic based on your organization, based on your strategy and priorities. A lot of organizations will find that they spend a lot more time than they expected. They have trouble estimating the amount of time, and there's a lot of disappointment that comes along with running over the estimated time frame. You run into issues with change fatigue and people getting burned out on the project. So there's a lot of problems that come along with not having a realistic implementation duration to begin with. So what I want to talk about today is how to define the implementation duration that makes the most sense for your organization, and to tailor that estimated duration based on who you are as an organization. So to start, the first input into estimating your implementation duration is to get the proposals and the estimated plans from your software vendor, your system integrators, whoever it is you might be interacting with on your project. So to start, we'll take that as an input. We'll just call this the proposed plan. And the problem is, a lot of companies take this at face value. They get whatever boilerplate, generic template they get from their vendor and system integrators. They'll assume that that's the duration it's going to take. Even if they add a little bit of contingency to that, it's typically still not enough for organizations. And typically these numbers, the durations that you get in a proposed plan, are typically a lot lower than reality. And so let's unpack that and understand why that is, first of all, and then we'll talk about how to translate this into something that's more meaningful for you as an organization. The first issue that we have with these types of plans is that there are assumptions that are flawed. So in other words, the assumptions aren't necessarily something that matches your needs as an organization. For example, it may assume that you are going to make decisions very quickly, or that your business processes aren't going to change that much, or that you're going to have a big bang approach when maybe a phased approach is more suitable for you as an organization. So there's a lot of assumptions here that no matter what kind of due diligence and discovery a software vendor does, part of the challenge is that the assumptions still aren't going to be aligned with what your needs are. So that's one challenge that we have with these project plans. The second challenge that we have with these types of proposed plans is that they are not all-inclusive. What I mean by that is your software vendor, your system integrator typically is not going to provide, either because they can't, don't want to, don't have the right competency, whatever the case may be. They typically don't provide all of the things you need to make your transformation successful. So not including all the things that are required for a successful transformation is another problem. So let's just say, for example, the vendor proposes to you that they can get this done in 12 months. Well, they may not have considered the fact that there's data migration, there's change management, and a number of other things that they may not do that needs to be factored into your plan. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, so we'll come back to that point here in just a second. So that's a second challenge that we find that will misalign your proposed plan with the actual reality that we'll talk about here in a moment. And then the next challenge we have is that organizations, system integrators, vendors that are providing these proposed plans, we just have to recognize the realities. This isn't meant to be malicious. I don't think software vendors are trying to lie or deceive, but they're salespeople and they are in sales mode. So what I mean by that is they're not necessarily incented or incentivized to be overly conservative and assume the worst, assume it's going to take you a lot longer than maybe you could implement if things were perfect. So being that they're in sales mode, they're probably in a competitive situation. They probably know they're in a competitive situation. They've got commissions they need to meet. They've got to make a certain number of sales to save their jobs, protect their jobs, and to make money. So all the incentives for them are to downplay and to maybe suggest that in a perfect world, you could implement their solution in X amount of time. So we have to recognize that that's another challenge or another strike here with this proposed plan, is that it's not aligned necessarily with reality. It's aligned with what they think they can sell. Now, just to back up for a second, I'm going to talk about what to do to translate this into a more realistic plan. But before we do that, the first thing to recognize is that when we look at an actual project plan for any implementation that's been completed, we've done research over the years and found that the average implementation in reality, not in a proposed plan, but in reality, takes about 18 months. So I'm just going to mark that here so you can just have that in the back of your mind, that most implementations take around 18 months. Now, this is an average. If you're a big multinational company, it's going to take you longer. If you're a smaller organization with not a very complex set of needs, you could possibly do this in less time. But let's just use that as an average, as 18 months. And by the way, this is data that we published in our 2020 ERP report. You can find that and download that report along with other benchmarks and data points, best practices in the links below. So we'll hold on to that 18 months and we'll come back to that here in a second. Now, to translate this into a plan that makes the most sense for you, the first step we have to do is to add the variables that are unique to us. So we're just going to call these unique variables. These are the things that drive implementation durations up or down. And by the way, these same variables also apply to cost, which is a topic for another time. But these unique variables are things that we need to think of it as kind of a visual here. We're gonna run these through the machine of adding reality, adding our unique factors to translate this into something that comes out the other side as something more realistic for us. Now, the first thing we need to look at is the complexity of your business. So companies that are more complex, they just inherently are going to take longer. They might be longer than 18 months. If you're a simple business that's a pure distribution company, you're focused on volume, you're not selling a very complex product, you already have e-commerce and other capabilities built to support the business, you might get this done sooner. And you certainly will get this done sooner, most likely, than a complex aerospace and defense manufacturer or a custom manufacturer of building supplies or whatever the case may be. So the complexity of your business is the first step. The next thing we look at is number of locations. So how many locations are you operating out of? Are you a single location? Are you multiple locations? Are you 10, 20, 30? And not just number of locations, but number of countries you operate in. So a company that's based in, let's just say in the UK, and they have 10 locations in the UK, is going to have a very different implementation time frame than another company, same industry, that has 10 locations, but those 10 locations are spread across Europe or across multiple continents. Those are going to be very different implementations. And certainly a single location client is typically going to take less time than one that perhaps has dozens or in some cases hundreds of locations. The next thing we have to think about is magnitude of change. This is one that's underrated, one that not enough companies think about. So the magnitude of change is something we need to think about, and think of this as a spectrum. I'm just going to whiteboard just some rough notes down here. Let's just consider this no change at all. This is massive change. Depending on where you are on the spectrum, that's going to drive how much time you take. So companies that are focused over here on big change, they're going to take longer than the companies that are more over here, closer to incremental change, or in some extreme cases, there's companies that are just simply automating what they're already doing, and they have no aspirations to go through a major transformation, and that's okay, as long as they're deliberate about what they're doing there. So the magnitude of change we're going through is another big driver of our overall implementation duration. The next thing we need to think about is how well defined are our business processes. And I'm not saying how well are they, how effective are they. I'm saying how well are they defined? How well do we understand them? Are they documented? Is there a lot of work we have to do to define those processes? So process definition is very important. The companies that already have a pretty good handle on their current state, even though that current state's going to change, they tend to go a little faster through the implementation because they have a good starting point to launch from. Whereas companies that don't have that handle end up spending more time on defining that current state so they can get to that future state. And we actually have a whole video focused on how to handle business process mapping, when we do it, how much do we focus on as is versus to be. I've included a link to that video as well below. Along these same lines, a process definition is level of standardization. So if we are moving from a decentralized model to a highly centralized, standardized model, that's going to take longer. That's going to drive this plan to higher implementation duration simply because it's a bigger change. So it ties back to this magnitude of change component here. So that's something to watch for, because a lot of companies are trying to get standardization, but they base their plan on getting there based on the initial plan that they get from their vendors and system integrators. The other driver of your implementation duration is going to be the level of alignment. What I mean by that is internal alignment. So how well aligned is the executive team on what they want this project to be, what they want to be when they grow up? How well aligned is the project team on how they can best support that vision for the company? And how well aligned is the overall internal team? Now, this is a hard one for people in organizations to assess. And actually, a lot of these things are difficult for people to assess unless you've done a lot of ERP implementations in the past. But this one in particular is difficult because it may be all you know. You may just be used to the political environment, the internal dynamics you have, and most of your people may be used to it. But what we do as outside consultants is assess and benchmark you to other organizations based on what we see and what we gather through organizational assessments and other inputs that we gather through the process to figure out how well aligned are you now. And the less aligned you are right now, the more time it's going to take, just because it's going to take some time to get people aligned and get them on the same page before we start building and deploying new processes and new technologies. And then finally, there's a lot more than just the ones we're covering here today, but I'm covering the major components of what drives implementation duration. Another one is the level of technical change. So this is a little bit different. I do think it's worth calling out, even though it's similar to magnitude of change. Here we're talking about the level of technical change and technology change. So in particular, if we're moving from let's say we're moving from a legacy AS400 based system, fairly immature product, maybe it's been heavily customized. Now we're going to roll out a heavily standardized system like SAP or Oracle or one of these modern, robust, complex, sophisticated systems. That's a big technical change for people, and it drives this magnitude of change. But we call it out here because it's also important to look at how does that affect your IT department, because your IT department supporting the project in some way is also going to be impacted, and that often requires a redesign of the organization within IT, which will take longer to deploy for the overall transformation. The next thing we need to do to get to our idealistic or our tailored implementation plan is going to be to add to our scope. And that may sound counterintuitive, like how can we add to our scope? Why would we want to add to our scope before we've ever started? Let me tell you what I mean by that. Now, I mentioned before that the proposed plan that you typically get from your software vendors, your system integrators, are not all inclusive. They're almost always, in most cases that I can recall, missing some major components that are going to be critical to your success. Either they're things that you need to hire outside help for, or it might be things you have internal resources that can help with, but either way, it's going to take time and resources, which is going to affect your overall implementation duration. So we need to add to our scope. We need to add these things back to our scope so that we are basing our estimated time based on the actual scope of the project. Now, some of the things that come to mind and some of the high priority things, the most common things that are missing from scope are going to be things like change management. So organizational change management, or OCM. Those are things that's something that's almost always missing from these system integrator plans. They'll typically have training, communications, some basic downstream change management activities, but they're more often than not missing some of the critical strategic change management things that need to happen earlier and early in the project, things that will help you drive alignment, things that will help you drive the magnitude of change, the organizational readiness, the organizational design as we define how our processes are going to be defined, or how our processes and our organization is going to be standardized. All those things require organizational change support. Otherwise, we risk all of this stuff happening in a vacuum on a piece of paper, a conceptual model that we haven't actually rolled out. So we need to have an organizational change support team that can support these activities to help drive that, and that does take time, and that's going to add duration to your overall project. And then, by the way, it's something I highly recommend not cutting, thinking that that's going to save you time, because if you cut this out of scope or assume that since that adds time, we're actually going to take it away, what that actually does is that increases your duration even more. So keep in mind, this was never reality. If we add OCM, yes, it is going to stretch it out, but if we don't add OCM, it's going to stretch it out even more. So adding OCM is actually your best bet to actually realize a faster implementation. Now, another common component we see missing is the whole data migration bucket. And a lot of times, this task or activity is relegated to a bulleted footnote or assumption in the statement of work from the system integrator or vendor, that says that customer shall be responsible for data migration. Now, the software vendor and the system integrator might provide you some tools to help with data migration. They might actually help you migrate the data over to the new system, but they typically are going to leave it on you to clean up your data, to map the data to the new system, to figure out how you're going to bring it over, that sort of thing. And even if they do help you with that, typically this activity takes a lot longer than is assumed over here. Keep in mind, this is an ideal state utopia that rarely ever materializes, this proposed plan. So back to the assumptions here, we often assume in these proposed plans that data migration is going to be simple, your data is clean, and it's going to map very neatly over to the new system, which is rarely true. So this activity, whether it's included in your system integrator's plan or not, or whether you need to do it yourself, typically adds to the duration of the project. Now, just a couple other things, and this is a very long list, so I'll only cover the high points or the high priority points here. But some of the other ones include program management. Just the overall governance, the decision-making that goes into this, pulling together resources outside of what the system integrator and vendor are providing, managing all those resources, that takes time, and that typically extends your duration. There's also the process mapping, the process definition. So keep in mind, if I'm a software vendor, I don't necessarily care what your business processes are going to look like as long as I can build the software, design it, and configure it and customize it in a way that I think meets those needs. And that may or may not entail business process mapping. But if I don't do the business process mapping, I don't take the time to do that, it's going to be very difficult to train people. It's going to be very difficult to go through user acceptance testing in a comprehensive way. So we really need to make sure that's done. And ideally, we've done this process mapping before we've actually started deploying the technology. Companies that spend more time up front before bringing on all the consultants to start building stuff, companies that have done more of this work up front are going to implement faster than ones that haven't. So the degree to which you've done business process mapping prior to the implementation definitely affects your overall plan and scope. And then finally, a bucket that I'll cover here today is, we'll call it the system architecture. And I don't want to get too technical here, partly because I'm not a super technical person to begin with, but partly because it's not the technical nature of this that matters. What matters is that when we talk about system architecture, we're assuming there's going to need to be third-party integration to other systems. Oftentimes up here, we're assuming that we're not going to integrate, or that the ERP system we've selected is going to cover all the needs of the organization. But inevitably, as the project continues in its duration, we find that there's a need to integrate to other third-party systems, and this can hold up a project and delay it. So we need to make sure we've got eyes wide open into what are these potential third-party systems. And just as a word of warning, if you've bought an ERP system and assume that's going to do everything that you need it to be, I would take a long, hard look at that and make sure that that's true, because we find more often than not that that's not true. Even if a system integrator or VAR or vendor tells you that the ERP system can do everything that you think you need it to do, we find that if you really dig into it during your evaluation process, you'll find otherwise. So make sure you've accounted for that activity in your implementation planning. So I've given you some high-level conceptual things to think about here. Now, what I haven't done is told you exactly how do I get from this 18-month average to a number that makes sense for us. I've told you generally what's going to drive those numbers up or down, some of the things we need to make sure we have included in our scope, which will drive your project duration most likely up. And there is a combination of science and art that goes into this. That's the scope for another project, another discussion. But I would encourage you, if you do want to talk more about this and how we actually apply specific numbers to get to that conceptual number that we think it's going to take, I encourage you to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below, as well as a number of links to other resources that might help you in your digital transformation. So I encourage you to check those out in the links below. Now that we've talked about the fundamentals of what project management is and how to go through the planning process, now let's talk about some of the behavioral aspects of what makes a good project manager. And this is really important because a lot of times, again, project managers think that their definition of success is going to be their level of certification, whether or not they completed a project on time, on budget, whether or not they've checked all the boxes. It's sort of that science of project management. But there's also an art to project management that, in my opinion, gets overlooked far too often. And so that's really what we want to talk about in this next segment, is what is it that makes a project manager successful? And just as a spoiler alert, the number one thing is not going to be how certified you are or how many projects you've been through. It's going to be some intangible things that you might not have thought about. So let's dive into this next segment. So what I want to talk about today are some of the key skill sets and competencies that you should be thinking about as you develop into a project management role, or if you're looking for a project manager, these are the types of skills that I'd recommend you look for. Now, the first and probably most obvious competency that's important to being an effective project manager is a technical knowledge. And it's not just technical knowledge in terms of knowing hands-on how a certain technology works. So for example, if you're implementing SAP or Oracle or whatever the ERP system or technology of choice might be, it's important to have some hands-on knowledge with that particular solution and know how the solution works and how to configure the solution and how to integrate and that sort of thing. But what's even more important from a technology perspective, other than the technology itself or the software itself, is understanding technology and how it all ties together. So in other words, looking at things from a solution architecture perspective and really understanding how multiple systems might tie together, because rarely does a company implement just one technology. Typically, they're implementing multiple technologies that need to tie together. So having that vision and understanding of solution architecture and how different technologies might tie together is one example. Another example is understanding data and security and really understanding how, regardless of what technology you're deploying, how would data and security become part of your overall digital transformation. So these are just two examples of things that you want to have in terms of technical competencies in addition to an understanding of the software being implemented. So while the technology components and competencies are important, it's probably the least important part of all the different skill sets we'll talk about here in this list. The second thing is business process and operational understanding. That's an example of something that's even more important than an understanding of the technology itself. Someone that can really dive into a business operational setting and understand how different functions within a business work is going to be much more valuable than just understanding how the software can be configured or how to develop the software or whatever the case may be. So having that big picture understanding of what the business needs are, how the business works, how the business could work better with new technology, that strategic and operational understanding is something that's very important, but oftentimes overlooked and underrated among project managers in digital transformations. So in addition to understanding how business processes work and how technology can align with those business processes, it's also really important to recognize and understand the analytical side of business processes and operations, and understanding how processes can be improved, where the weak spots are, where the opportunities for improvement are, and really focusing on that big picture and strategic understanding and analysis of how we can make those business processes better. So it's not just a matter of understanding business processes and how the business works, but even more importantly, how can we make them better using new technology? So that's a really important capability for effective project management. And what I believe is the single most important skill set and characteristic of effective project managers and some of the most effective project managers I've worked with in my career, it's that ability to have very strong communication and leadership skills. Set aside the technology understanding and even the business process understanding, the operational understanding I've already talked about. Someone that's a very strong leader and can communicate well, I'll take that person's skill set over someone that might be stronger in some of those other areas any day of the week. So what I mean by strong communication and leadership is just someone that knows and understands how important communications is. Not just in terms of sending out an occasional newsletter updating stakeholders on where we are with the project, but really getting your hands dirty and understanding with various stakeholders and business people throughout the organization what their needs are, where their pain points are, working with the internal project team, the transformation project team, to make sure that all the pieces are tying together, and really having that strong communication that's very important. And similarly, leadership is very important. Just someone that can take ownership and take a lead and not defer too much to technology or not defer too much to a boilerplate or cookie cutter project plan, but someone that can think very strategically about how we're going to lead this transformation in a way that's truly going to enable business process improvements. So leadership, communications, those are very critical to effective project management. And the problem is most people, or a lot of people I should say, that are focused on technology have a different skill set and a different personality that doesn't always align with strong leadership and communications. Oftentimes, project managers have very deep technical capabilities because that's the world they came up in, but they haven't developed those leadership and communications capabilities to be effective. So the better you can be at leadership and communications, the stronger and more effective you're going to be as a project manager. Another important characteristic, which is similar to leadership and communications, but a bit different, is just that experience with broad change transformations. having been through a big business transformation in the past is very important. So in addition to understanding technology and how technology aligns with operations, and even in addition to having that leadership and communication foundation to be successful, you also want to have that background and understanding and experience with big, massive transformations like the one you're about to go through. So having that experience level and having been through not just the technical components of a transformation, but also the process and the people side of things is very important. Now, this isn't to suggest that to be a good project manager, you need to have organizational change management certification or specialization in something like organizational change management. But if you have done change management types of activities in the past and been involved with training or communications or organizational design, that depth and understanding of some of the more strategic aspects of the organization and the transformation is going to serve you very well as a project manager, or if you're looking for a project manager, someone who has that capability is going to be very effective in that role. So really finding ways to develop and demonstrate that change leadership and that change management type of competency is something that makes for a strong project manager as well. Now, in what I believe to be the least important of the skills that I'll talk about here today, but still fairly important, is the whole concept of certifications and having certification around certain competencies that good project managers need to have. And I get emails all the time from people looking for career advice or people that are looking to hire a project manager for their transformation. And they ask me what kind of certification should I be looking for in a good project manager. And while I don't want to be completely dismissive of the whole certification process, what I would say is that while certification certainly can't hurt, all the other stuff I've talked about here today is much more important than any sort of certification you might get. But if all things being equal, you have two candidates that have everything I've talked about here today, certification can certainly be something that tips the scale in their favor. And there's no one standard certification that a good project manager should have, but some examples of certifications that might help you develop some of the skills you need might be PMP certification, for example, which is focused on project management. But beyond that, there's also technical certifications too. So being certified in whatever technology is being deployed could also help you in some ways. Having ProSci certification on the change management side of things can be very effective as well. So these are just three examples of different types of certifications that you might look for. But what I would say just as a summary is to really make sure that you think outside the box and don't just look at the technical or the project management types of certifications. Also look for leadership and change management, communications, and other types of certifications that can help you be a more well-rounded leader and project manager. So being an effective project manager in a successful digital transformation requires a very broad skill set, and that's what makes the job so hard. And that, quite frankly, is why so many digital transformations fail, is because so few good project managers have these sorts of capabilities and skill sets and the breadth of competencies that are required. So when you're thinking about your career as a project manager, or if you're looking to hire a project manager for your digital transformation, really think about the big picture and what is that well-rounded person going to be able to provide to me, and what does that person's profile need to look like to be effective in this transformation. Now finally, let's look at why project managers fail. There's 10 reasons we've identified and 10 behavioral traits and actions that oftentimes lead to failure. And we see this time and time again working with client project teams and especially with technical consultants and software vendors. They make some of these same mistakes. And again, a lot of times it's not based on lack of technical knowledge. It's not based on lack of project management certification or training. It's more a lack of understanding of the balance between art and science and just the experience with helping complex digital transformations from a business perspective. So let's dive into what those top 10 reasons for why project managers fail, and hopefully this sheds some light on some ways that you can work to upskill yourself to be a more effective project manager. So what I want to talk about today are those 10 things that we most commonly see project managers struggle with, and in many cases fail miserably, which leads to a failed transformation. So I want to talk about those 10 things here today. One of the most common pitfalls of being a project manager on an IT-related project, digital transformation, ERP project, whatever it may be, is to focus too much on the technology. We become so enamored by and fixated on the technology that we miss out on all the other nuances that are critical to a successful project. So for example, things like organizational change management, business process improvement, data migration, how the different technologies tie together, that overall architecture, overall internal alignment. Those are some of the things that really don't have a lot to do with the software, the technology itself, but they're highly critical to the success of a project. So a good rule of thumb is if you're spending more than 70 or 80% of your time as a project manager either addressing or chasing down issues or firefighting issues related to the technology, chances are you're at risk of failing in this area of spending too much time focusing on the technology, not enough time on the business. Another common issue we see with project managers in transformations is that they confuse or interchange project management with program management. And what I mean by that is project management is focused typically on a specific work stream within an overall program. And it's more important to think of your transformation as a program. There's multiple work streams with multiple areas that you should be focusing on. So you certainly have your technical work stream, which is where, as I mentioned in the previous point, most project managers tend to focus on that technical work stream. But you also need to have a work stream related to organizational change and organizational design, process improvement, data migration, all the other stuff that's going to make or break your project. So when you're planning for your project, when you're defining your role as a project manager, when you're allocating resources, make sure that you're not viewing it as a project, but an overall program that has multiple work streams that need to be managed. The third common pitfall is to not get involved enough in your business operations. So before, when I was talking about being too involved in your technology, you might want to redirect some of that time and focus less time on untangling and figuring out the technology and focus on untangling and figuring out your business and how your business is going to look in the future. And this may require you not to necessarily be an expert in all the different parts of the business that you're working in, but to partner with those that do understand the business and make sure that you're understanding what the key issues and business drivers are so that you can act as a sort of a conduit or a translator from what those business needs are into that technology work stream. So to be an effective project manager, it really helps to get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves, and really understand the business operations as part of your role. Now, I've mentioned change management a few times in this video so far, and a lack of focus on change management is one of the most common failure points that we see with project managers. And part of the reason for this is that project management is a fairly scientific, tangible, very predictable, hands-on type of a role, and most of the training focuses on Gantt charts and tasks and resource allocations and things like that, whereas organizational change management is less of a science and more of an art. It's more objective, or it's more subjective, and you've got to figure out what the nuances are of your organization and your culture and how to navigate those nuances. So be sure that as part of your role, you're not only looking at technology, you're not only getting your hands dirty at the operations, but you're also diving into the organization, and at the very least having people on your team that can help dive into the organization to help define how you're going to navigate some of those nuances and some of those organizational challenges that inevitably haunt most projects. Another common challenge is inaccurate scoping, not having a clear handle on what it's going to take to get the project done right. This comes down to having a realistic time frame, a realistic plan, realistic resource schedule, a realistic budget. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times organizations start their projects with unrealistic expectations, and they have these proposed project plans and budgets from their software vendor that doesn't take into account the breadth of the scope that goes outside the realm of what a software vendor typically does. So again, getting back to some of those non-technical work streams I mentioned before, that will inevitably impact your overall time frame, your budget, your resource plan, and all that good stuff. So when you're defining what your scope is, you want to make sure you're not just looking at the technology, but the other parts of the business as well. And you also want to make sure you're looking at the assumptions of your plan, making sure that the assumptions of what the vendor has in mind for their role on the project, make sure that aligns with your expectations and that you've covered all the nooks and crannies of what needs to be covered as part of one of these projects, and that those assumptions are aligned with your overall strategic direction and goals and objectives as an organization. So make sure you have an accurate scope, and really honing in on tightening up your scoping process is one way to avoid some of the common failures that many project managers face. Similar to an inaccurate scope, an unrealistic budget is another failure point for many project managers. And again, this is a situation where oftentimes people hang their hat on the proposal they get from their software vendor. They take that at face value and they draw a line in the sand or plant a pole in the ground saying that this is our budget for the project, but they haven't accounted for all those non-vendor types of costs that come along with the typical transformation. So again, think back to those work streams that are non-technical in nature, the change management, the process improvement, even the data migration, the integration of third-party systems. Those are the things that are going to increase the budget, increase the cost of your overall implementation. And you also want to look at your internal resources too and make sure that you've accounted for the fact that you're going to be leveraging a lot of internal resources on your project. Now we need to figure out how we're going to backfill those resources so they can continue to do their day-to-day jobs and run the operations. So those are just a few examples of how you can mitigate the risk of not having an accurate budget. And one of the biggest things you can do is make sure you have a contingency, because you may not be able to predict the future with 100% accuracy, like most of us are unable to. So having some sort of a contingency of at least 15% to account for those unknowns and those surprises that come along the way can be one way to mitigate against this risk. A failure to allocate proper resources to a project is another failure point of project managers. And again, it's important to combine art with science here. What looks good on paper may not make sense for your organization. It may not be realistic for your organization because perhaps those resources that you're allocating to your project are tied up with other projects or other internal initiatives or priorities. So that's just one example. You want to make sure that you've sanitized or validated the assumptions and how you allocate resources, and that you have a realistic plan for those resources. And to the extent that you don't have the proper amount of resources that you think it's going to take to get the job done right, that's where, from a project governance perspective, you can escalate that issue to your executive steering committee and really seek to get more focus on the project or more resources allocated to the project if that's indeed what you need. But either way, you want to make sure you have a realistic vision and view of what those real resource requirements are and ensure that that's aligned with the realities of your day-to-day operation. Now here's one that I think is actually one of the biggest ones out of the 10, and that is the focus of project managers on checking boxes rather than checking quality. And what I mean by that is there's a difference between saying yes, a certain task has been done, or no, a task has not been completed, versus yes, it's been done, but it hasn't been done the way it should be, or it's only 60% of the way accurate or 60% of what it should be. So this, again, is where project managers oftentimes struggle with the balance between art and science. The science may say, yes, we've completed a certain task, but the art of project management requires you to look into the deliverables, look at those blueprint documents, the design documents, the requirements documents, the test plan, the test scripts, whatever the deliverable or output might be. You need to be able to look at it, or at the very least, lead your team to look at it, to really look at it with a critical set of eyes to make sure that we're answering the question, not just did we do it, but did we do it well, and did we do it in a way that reflects who we are as a business and what we're trying to accomplish with this transformation. So make sure that you really understand that important, small but big nuance between checking a box versus checking the quality of the deliverables throughout the project. Failing to identify and mitigate risks is another common challenge that project managers face. And this is because oftentimes project managers haven't been through these sorts of transformations enough to anticipate what those risks might be until the risks become so out of control that it's obvious that it's become a problem. The other challenge is that those that think of project management as project management versus program management tend to focus on the risks of the technology, but they don't identify the risks of the operations, the organization, what might happen after go live if we don't address some of those risks. Those are some of the things that require a great deal of experience and also a great deal of combination of art and science. So identifying a quality assurance framework and a risk mitigation framework and using those tools and applying your experience to identify those risks and mitigate those risks is something that's very critical to any sort of successful transformation. Now finally, the 10th thing that project managers often do poorly is they fail to recognize the messiness and the need to address internal alignment. It's a messy process, it's not always clean. Most organizations are, in fact, misaligned. And many project managers just try to power through that and fight upstream or swim upstream to just deal with the fact that we have misalignment. And to most project managers' credit, that's the sign of someone who's really trying to push forward and make progress on a project. But again, you're really facing headwinds if you don't address those things. So you want to make sure that you address that internal alignment, ensure that your team is aligned, and when you're not aligned, make sure that you're pulling people together to get that alignment, get consensus on what the path forward is. And if you can't do that, then you want to escalate it to your executive steering committee, or your executive sponsor to have them make the decision. But either way, you want to make sure you have clarity on some of these major business decisions that inevitably come from any digital transformation. So I hope this has provided some guidance and understanding and a deeper level understanding of what it takes to be an effective project manager. If you'd like to learn more about project management, digital transformations in general, I encourage you to check out our resource center on our website. We have tons of information out there, including white papers, reports, independent reviews, and comparisons of different software systems in the marketplace. Certainly a lot of content about project management, change management, digital strategy, all kinds of stuff that is meant to be an invaluable free resource for you to help you through your digital transformation. So to find some of these resources, scan the QR code right here. That'll take you to our resource center on our website. You can also find a link to it below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day. Project management is one of the most complex essentials of what makes a strong project management.